Job insists to Eliphaz that God's ways are dark to him, and yet he can see that God allows the lawless to prosper. Let's open the book and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Last time, Job was answering Eliphaz's argument, where Eliphaz once again insisted that God would not be benefited in any way by Job being wicked or righteous, so that God therefore must have judged him partially. And he must have judged Job to be wicked and have done wickedness. And he just tells Job, if you'll turn from your wickedness and obey God's commands, everything will be wonderful for you, you'll be rich, you'll walk in the light, and it'll all be good. But Job insisted in answering him that was wrong. That he knew that God could see him, that he had walked in God's commandments. And the problem wasn't that God couldn't see his ways, but that he couldn't see God's. That he didn't understand what God was doing or why God caused this calamity to come upon him when here he hadn't done any wickedness. So today we will continue with Job's reply to Eliphaz's third address. And we'll be starting in Job chapter 23 and verse 11. And once again, I'll be reading out of the version of Job, the lyrical metrical version of Job by Dr. E.W. Bullinger in his companion Bible. He says, Job 23, verse 11, My foot unto his steps hath firmly held. His way I have observed, nor gone aside. So Job insists, I didn't do all these things you accuse me of, Eliphaz. I didn't turn aside from God's ways and think I could get away with it and God wouldn't see. No, I followed God's ways constantly. I observed them. I didn't go aside. Verse 12. From his commands I have not turned back. His words I prized more than my daily food. So Eliphaz told Job, just acquaint yourself with God and lay up his words and do his commandments, and all will be well with you, Job. You'll be rich like you were before. You'll have money. You'll have wealth. You'll have friends. Your life will be wonderful like it was before if you'll just obey God and follow his commandments. But Job said, Eliphaz, I already prized God's word as more vital than my food. Now, the Hebrew here is actually more vital than my own law. But the law here is put by a Hebrew figure of speech where one noun is substituted for another related to it. So law is put for what is allowed by the law. That is Job's ordinary allowance, his appointed portion. In other words, his food. So that kind of interprets the figure rather than just translating it. But yes, Job is saying that he prized God's commands more than his daily allotment of food. And so that's how much he prized God's commands. And here, Eliphaz was saying that Job rejected and spurned God's commands. He says, no, I prize them more than my meal. Verse 13, but he is God alone. Who turneth him? What he desireth, even that he doth. So Eliphaz claimed that if Job would just act differently, that would force God to act differently, that God would turn and bless him. That Job could manipulate God just by his actions. If Job does this, God will do this. And if Job does this, God will do that. And God will have to respond to whatever Job does exactly like Eliphaz thinks he should. But Job said, no, I obeyed God's commands. I faithfully followed them, and yet God did this to me. So if I did all that and God didn't bless me, how can I turn God? How can anyone turn God when he purposes to do something? What he desires, what his soul desires, the Hebrew says. Soul there is the Hebrew nephesh. And you can spell it N-E-F-E-S-H. And the nephesh is connected with the emotions and the desires. What God desires, he does, Job says. I can't just tweak my behavior a little bit and that will change what God does automatically. Verse 14, what is decreed for me he will perform, and many such decrees he hath in store. So Job says, I know God is going to do what he decreed for me. He's going to do it no matter what I do. No one can stop him. And apparently Job thinks he has many such decrees. He has all these horrible decrees of all these terrible things he wants to do to me. And I couldn't change them. For all my righteousness, I couldn't change them. And I couldn't be righteous and change them now. Verse 15, shut from his presence out, I am in fear. I think of him and I am sore afraid. So Job believes he's been shut out from God's presence. The Hebrew is actually from God's face. It's like God, he won't look at me anymore. He covers his face. He won't see me. He won't hear all my pleas for help. He won't see my pitiable condition and take pity. So he believes he's shut out from God's face. And Job says, I think of him and I'm sore afraid. I'm terrified of God now. Well, how could Job help but be terrified of God when he thought that God had brought all these horrible calamities upon him for no reason other than apparently God's own caprice? Well, Job, once again, we have to remember we're in the context of what was really going on, as we learned in the first 2 chapters of Job, is that the one really bringing calamity on Job is Satan. And Satan is the one Job ought to be terrified of, and not God, who had pled for Job. And yet I believe the machinations of the heavenly court, he had to answer Satan's accusation. But Job is afraid of God, not of Satan. Verse 16, for God it is who maketh faint my heart. Yea, Shaddai is the one who troubleth me. And notice Job is convinced of this. No thought of it being actually Satan doing this comes into his head. He says, it's God who makes my heart faint. That is the Hebrew El, which means the mighty God, the all-powerful God. Then he says, yea, Shaddai is the one who troubleth me. Shaddai is the all-bountiful God, the gracious giving God. So he says the God who's supposed to be giving and gracious is actually the one who's troubling me. And he's convinced that God is the one who's troubling him and making him faint. In reality, it was Satan. But again and again, he describes it to God, just like all Job's friends ascribe it to God. Verse 17, nor from the darkness am I thus dismayed, nor yet because thick darkness veils my face. Now, nor not from the darkness am I thus dismayed. From the darkness there is from the face of the darkness. And again, face means presence, from the presence of the darkness. Just like later in the verse, we have face. And back in verse 15, we had face for God's presence. And to be on someone's face in the Hebrews meant being in their presence. Now remember back to Eliphaz's third address that he claimed that if Job would obey God's commands, he said, quoting from Bullinger's version of what he said, over all thy ways the light shall shine, he says. If you'll just obey God's command, light will shine over all your ways. But Job says, I obeyed all God's commands and I'm in the presence of darkness, in the face of darkness. Yet he says, it's not the darkness I'm dismayed of. It's not the thick darkness that veils my face I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of God, the one who did all this to me. So chapter 23, basically Job's contention, his argument is that I know my ways aren't hidden from God. The problem is God's ways are hidden from me. I don't understand why he's doing this to me. So that brings us to chapter 24. And Job continues his answer to Eliphaz's third address. And in this portion, he shows how God allows the lawless to prosper. Unlike what Eliphaz says, that God always brings the lawless into punishment. Verse 1, since then events from Shaddai are not hid, why do not they who love him know his ways? So remember that Eliphaz claimed that Job thought that his ways were hidden from God, that God couldn't see what he was doing. But Job insisted, no, I know my ways aren't hidden from God. But what does this mean? So why doesn't Shaddai, the bountiful God, the giving God, why doesn't he let Job know what his ways are and why he's doing what he's doing? When Job tried to serve him, when Job tried desperately to be righteous, and yet God brought all this calamity upon him, why won't Shaddai, the bountiful one, show Job his ways and why he's doing this? So again, the problem is not that Job thinks his ways are hidden from God. The problem is that God's ways are hidden from Job. Verse 2, the lawless men, their neighbors' landmarks move. They seize on flocks and feed them as their own. So he speaks of the crimes of lawless men. He knows these crimes. He hasn't done them, and he knows them. Of course, his friends were accusing him of doing them. And Eliphaz certainly claimed that Job had done some of these things. Now understand that at the time, land was a precious commodity. And who owned land was determined by landmarks. They were set out to mark out the land. And yet the lawless, what would they do? Well, they could go out and move their neighbors' landmarks to steal land for themselves, this precious commodity of land. Then they seize on flocks and feed them as their own. And that, in the U.S., we'd call that rustling. Rustling someone else's flocks. They would rustle someone else's flocks and add them to their own. Verse 3, some from the fatherless drive off their ass and take the widow's ox from her in pledge. Now, in their society, the father, the patriarch, was not only the leader of the family, but the protector of the family. All the family depended on him for defense and protection. And so the fatherless, the young man or child who had no father, would be without protection. Now, if his father was dead, he was probably impoverished and depending very much on the little he had, like his donkey. He could do some work in the fields with a donkey. He could earn a little living with a donkey. And yet the lawless men, they say, a fatherless person with no one to protect him, I'll steal his donkey and take away his only means of earning a living. A heartless and cruel thing to do, as well as a greedy one. Or the widow. Again, a woman couldn't head a household. She couldn't protect her family. It needed a man to do that. So a widow with no son to take care of her was helpless. Now, if she had an ox, she could at least earn a little living with the ox. But these wicked, they don't care. They'd say, a widow with no protection, great, I can steal her ox, and she'll have no recourse. I can take away her only means of livelihood, and it'll be an easy steal. Verse 4, while others turn the needy from their way, and all the poor and wretched hide themselves. So other wicked people turn the needy out of the way. They are in need. They're seeking some way to provide for themselves, and yet they turn them out of the way. The poor and wretched hide themselves from wicked people like this. And even today, there are some who will oppress the poor and ignorant. Immigrants to the country who don't understand the laws and the rules and basically how things work in this land, why they can take advantage of them. They just say easy marks. Or the ignorant, the uneducated, they say easy marks. Now this poor of the earth, the word earth there is translated from Hebrew eretz. And eretz could be either earth or land depending on the context. So Job could mean the poor of the land hide themselves. Verse 5, behold them, as wild asses they go forth, and on the plains they seek early their prey. The barren steppe doth yield their children food. So these poor and wretched, when their meager means to earn a living are stolen by these heartless, cruel, wicked people, why they're just driven out from humankind. They have no money to stay in the city, so like a wild donkey they have to go out into the wilderness. And they have to be on the plains to seek their prey. They have to try to become hunter-gatherers. And the barren steppe, barren country, is what yields their children food. They have to find food in the wilderness for their children because of what the wicked did to them in taking away their meager means of livelihood. Verse 6, they reap down corn in fields which are not theirs. The vineyard of the wicked they do dross. Now reap here is a word repeated. Reaping they reap down corn in fields which are not theirs. Now corn in the Old English was just a generic word that meant grain. I mean, in America, we've specialized corn to mean the American grain, what the Indians used to call maize, but we've called it corn, and so we don't think of that word as being a generic word for grain anymore, but that's what it used to be. So they reap grain in fields which are not theirs. Now this refers to something that the law allowed. The law said, when you harvest your fields, don't harvest the corners, and if you drop a sheaf, don't pick it up. And the poor and miserable have no other means to support themselves. Let them come out your field and reap those corners that you skipped or pick up those sheaves that you dropped and didn't pick up. So these poor people, that's what they have to do. They have no home. They're living in the wilderness. They have to go into fields after the harvesters and take what's left. And then the vineyard of the wicked they do dress. So they have to try to hire themselves out to work in someone else's vineyard. They have no property of their own, so they have to work someone else's property. And where are they working? They're working in the vineyard of a wicked person. Maybe the very same wicked person who stole their livelihood in the first place. They're reduced to hiring themselves out to him. So he benefits, and they're harmed. They're the ones who are miserable, not the wicked person who stole from them, who deserves to be miserable. And in Eliphaz's philosophy, the wicked person always is the one who ends up miserable. Job is saying, no, it's the people the wicked oppress who end up miserable. And they have to hire themselves out to the wicked person who oppressed them, ultimate humiliation. And God does not punish these wicked people for what they did, like you claim. Verse 7, ill-clad they lodge without a covering, and without shelter are they from the cold. So the Hebrew actually says they are naked. But naked in Hebrew is often a bit of an exaggeration for ill-clad, poorly clad. Dressed in rags. They don't have decent clothing. And so they lodge without a covering. They have no roof over their heads, is our English phrase, our English way of putting it. And without shelter they are from the cold. They're out in the cold, exposed, without shelter. And again, this is all thanks to the oppression of the lawless who drove them out from what they had. So who is miserable because of the wickedness of the lawless? The wicked? No, the people they oppressed. Verse 8, with sweeping rain from mountain storm they're wet. For want of refuge they embrace the rock. So since they have no home or shelter, the rain rains on their heads. If they try to take shelter, they go up against some rock. Hopefully they can get, if the rain's coming, the wind's blowing up from a certain direction, they get on the side of the rock away from that. And that's all the poor shelter they have. And that's what happens to those that the wicked oppress. Verse 9. These tyrants tear the orphan from the breast. That which is on the poor they take to pledge. So he goes back to the oppressive tyrants. And he says they tear an orphan from the breast. Now understand, in their idea, an orphan, we think of an orphan as someone without father or mother, without a parent to take care of them. But because in their society, everything depended on the father. Someone whose father was dead and had no patriarch over the family to take care of them was helpless, was an orphan. And whether or not their mother was alive really didn't matter that much. So this orphan, whose father is dead, still has a mother, and yet these oppressive tyrants would tear this fatherless child from the breast of his mother, would take him away from his mother, the one person who cared about him. And that's the kind of person these tyrants are. Then the poor, they come to them, I just need some money to eat. Please loan me some money. They say, okay, but I'll take your garment and pledge. This is the only garment they have. And the law said, you don't take a garment from the poor and pledge. That's what God's law said. But these wicked are the kind of people who say, well, I want my money paid back. And if not, I get to keep their clothes. I don't care that they have nothing to dress themselves in. Now notice, this is exactly what Eliphaz accused Job of having done, taken a pledge from the poor. But Job argues that though he didn't do this at all, yet he argues that those who do this, who actually do take a pledge from the poor, get away with it. And it's the ones they oppressed who suffer, not the oppressors, and the ones who are oppressed suffer without retribution. No punishment comes on the wicked for having done this, like they claimed came on Job, and like they claimed always happens. Like Eliphaz claimed always happens. Verse 10, stripped of their scanty clothing they go forth, and hungry carry their taskmaster's sheaves. So these from whom they oppressed, from whom they stripped their clothing and pledge, they go out without clothing, poorly clad, and then they have to hire themselves out to a taskmaster, and they carry the sheaves of the taskmaster. What's a sheaf? It's grain, it's food. So they're hungry, they're desperately hungry. And yet they hire it out as a pair of hands, and they're carrying sheaves of food at the same time that they're desperately hungry. Here's the food that they need, and yet they're carrying it for a taskmaster and can't eat it themselves. A sheaf there is actually an omer, a unit of measurement. They carry omers of food, and yet they're hungry. They're desperately hungry. And this reminds me of the prodigal son in the New Testament who was feeding the pigs and longed to even eat the pigs' food, and yet no one offered it to him. Well, that's what's happening to these poor oppressed people that these tyrants oppressed. Verse 11, within their walls these poor press out their oil. Their wine presses they tread, yet suffer thirst. So again, they hire themselves out to the powerful and press out their oil. Or they tread their wine presses for others, having hired themselves out. All the while they have no oil or wine to satisfy themselves in their hunger and thirst. They're working with food, and yet they have nothing to eat themselves. Verse 12, from city and from houses groans ascend. With shrieks those being murdered cry for help. Yet God regards not this enormity. So he says groans come from the cities and from the houses because of this. This kind of oppression causes groans. And they arise and people know about them. Can't you hear them, Eliphaz? Haven't you ever noticed the people suffering like this because of the oppression of the powerful wicked? And then the souls, it's nephesh again. The souls of the victims of murder cry out for help. They shriek for help, help. But God doesn't swoop into the rescue. He doesn't save them. They get murdered. Go back to the first murdered one, Abel. Did God swoop in to rescue Abel from Cain? No, he didn't. Abel got killed. God admitted he was righteous. He chided Cain, but he didn't rescue Abel. God regards not this enormity. Now, God there is Eloah, the venerable God, the God who's worthy of worship. And yet the God who's worthy of worship doesn't stop the murderer from being murdered. He doesn't regard it in the sense that Job isn't saying God doesn't see it. He already said God sees these things. But God doesn't regard it, and then he doesn't do anything about it. He doesn't stop it. In Eliphaz's nice philosophy, God should stop it, but Eliphaz is in comfort and in power. He says, look to these powerless people who are being robbed from and murdered, and you see they don't share your comfortable philosophy, Eliphaz. Now there's a break here, and then we get to verse 13. Others again rebel against the light. They have no knowledge of its blessed ways. Neither abide they in the paths thereof. So he's now speaking of the rebels against the light themselves. They don't know its ways, and they don't walk in its paths. Now that's, of course, because they've rejected its ways and put it behind them. But they don't know the ways or walk in the paths of the light. Remember, Eliphaz accused Job of being one of these, and Job insisted he was not. But what of people like this? Verse 14, the murderer at daybreak riseth up, that he may slay the poor and destitute. And then again at night he plays the thief. So the murderer arises early in the morning to slay the weak and helpless. Now, the murderer can do this in the daytime because the weak and helpless have no recourse, no protection. And then again at night he plays the thief. So at night he goes out to steal from the wealthy. Because, of course, the wealthy, he wouldn't dare attack them during the day because they have power. But he attacks them at night under cover of darkness. Verse 15, the adulterer from midnight's darkness waits. No eye, saith he, shall see the path I take. And so he puts a covering on his face. So just like the thief depends on the cover of darkness to rob the houses of the wealthy, so the adulterer also acts at night to cover his deeds. And he covers over his face. He hides his face as he's going to his paramour's house. And thinking, if nobody sees me, then I'll get away with it. I'll get away with my adultery. Remember, Eliphaz accused Job of thinking this way, that he could veil his ways from God and God wouldn't see it and punish him for it. Verse 16, burglars break into houses in the dark, which they had set a mark on in the day. For such as these the daylight do not love. So he says, burglars too love the darkness. Of course, what do? We call it casing a house. They case a house during the day. Job says they set a mark on it. So they case the house during the day, and then they invade that house at night. He says this kind of people doesn't love the daylight. So they trust in darkness to cover their deeds. They don't love the daylight because the daylight could expose them and their deeds. But they love the darkness. Verse 17, to such the light is as the shade of death, for in the light death's terrors they discern. So they fear the light. Why? Because they fear exposure. The light to them as the terrors of death. If suddenly the light was shown in their burglary, if suddenly the light was shown in their adultery, why, they would pay for it. That would mean death. And so they love the darkness. Verse 18, swift as the rushing water's face, so will his cursed portion vanish from the earth, nor will he to his vineyard ere return. So this could mean once they are exposed, if they ever were exposed, why then swiftly they'd be taken from the earth. Their portion would be cursed, and their vineyard would never see them again. Now earth there is eretz, could also be they're taken from the land. Of course, both are true. And this is what ought to happen to the wicked. It would happen to them if they were exposed, but are they ever exposed? That's the question. Verse 19, as drought and heat to water turn the snows, e'en so will Sheol deal with those who sin. So what is the heat and the drought due to snow? Why, it causes it to disappear, to melt. So he says the grave, Hebrew, Sheol, and Sheol, as Otis Q often taught, was the state of death with resurrection in view. So it's the state of being dead. We don't have a word in English for the state of being dead. We don't have deaditude or something like that. But this is has to do with the state of the dead. Sheol deals with those who sin. The death state is waiting for the sinners. Verse 20, the womb which bore him doth forget him there. The worm doth feed on him and find him sweet. He will not be remembered any more. The wicked man lies shivered like a tree. So he describes the wicked in their final resting place of death. The womb that bore him, his mother forgets him in death. In death, the worm eats him and finds him good food. No one remembers and honors him anymore. He's not commemorated. He's gone. He's like a cut down tree. Cut down tree never stands again. Now this is, of course, assuming there is no redeeming resurrection for him, like Job believes that and hopes for, that he'll have a redeeming resurrection someday. He says these wicked have no such hope. But that's the wicked after death, but what about the wicked in life? Verse 21, again the wicked wrongs the barren wife, and to the widow no compassion shows. So again, the wicked wrong a woman without child. And this would probably be a widow without any grown son to care for her. So the wicked thinks, I can wrong this woman, she has no one to protect her. And to the widow no compassion shows. Again, the widow without a man to care for her. Well, these wicked don't care that they're helpless. In fact, the helpless just means an easier mark. Verse 22, and by his might he drags the strong away. He riseth up, no one is sure of life. So the wicked becomes so powerful that he's even powerful enough to attack the strong. He attacks the strong man and drags him away. And he's so powerful that when he goes into action, no one is sure of their life. No one's safe when he acts. That's how powerful this wicked tyrant is. And what does God do about it? Verse 23, God lets them rest secure and confident, though still his eyes are ever on their ways. So just like even the strong man can't stop him, neither does God act to stop him. God allows him to continue, confident in his wickedness and power, that no one can oppose him. So Job says, I don't deny that God sees his ways. I know he does. What I do deny is that God does anything about it. God just lets it happen. You know he does. I know he does. Just look at the world around you and see that he does. He lets the wicked get away with it and doesn't do anything. And Eliphaz, you claim God does, but that's an empty claim. Verse 24, they tower a little while and then are gone. Brought low they are, like others, gathered in, are cut off even as the ears of corn. So they continue in this confidence, these wicked. They tower for a little while. And then they're gone. They're brought low. But different from the righteous? No. Like everyone else. They're cut off like the ears of grain. Now, interestingly, cut off here is the same word that's often used for circumcision. Cutting off. As the ears of corn, this is actually the heads, the tops, the heads of the ears of corn are cut off. Of course, you don't You don't cut off below the head, you cut off the top of the head of the ear of corn. So he says, yes, they're brought low by death, but they're brought low just like everyone else. Nothing special happens to the wicked. They just die like their victims, like the righteous. Verse 25, if this be not so, who can prove me wrong or make my words to be of no account? So Job challenges them. If I'm wrong, disprove it. Show me that the wicked get punishment over the righteous. Show me that the ones really suffering aren't the oppressed and not the oppressors. Show me that. Show me evidence. Show me that in the world around you. Show me that that's actually how it works. Show me that anything happens to the wicked other than death, the same death that the ones they oppress die, the same death that the righteous die. Show me that anything else happens. These wicked seem to live stable lives before death finally brings them to their end. If not, prove it. Prove to me that the wicked always seek calamity. Prove it to me. And he knows his friends can't do that. He knows that they can look at the same world he can look at and see that the oppressed aren't avenged, that the wicked often get away with it and die without any punishment in this life. They can see that. So Job has thoroughly answered Eliphaz. Eliphaz's arguments sound nice. Oh, what a nice philosophy. Wouldn't it be great if someone who was a wicked oppressor always got his and always got taken down, and that the righteous always were blessed and always had wonderful good things? Wouldn't that be nice? And anybody living in an ivory tower can philosophize that that's the way things are, but get out on the streets where things are really happening, and you'll see that's not the way things are. And Eliphaz's arguments simply don't match with reality, although it would be nice if they did. So, Eliphaz claims that Job must have acted wickedly and oppressively and thought that God couldn't see and judge his ways. But Job insists, no, I followed God's commands. I did. And yet I still suffered this calamity. Far from dwelling in light when I followed God's commands, like Eliphaz said would happen, Job dwells in darkness. And what really happens to wicked people anyway? They take the means of livelihood from the weak and desperate, and then what happens? The weak and desperate live without shelter and clothing. They have to hire themselves out as laborers for the very wicked people who oppressed them in the first place. The wicked act in darkness, hoping it will hide them. Yet what brings their wickedness to an end? Calamity that doesn't come on the righteous? No, death, the same as what happens to everyone else. So where's this automatic calamity on the wicked that God always brings that Eliphaz claimed? It isn't real. It doesn't happen. Reality proves Eliphaz's nice-sounding philosophy a lie. Now you'd think this would be enough to shut up Job's three friends, but Bildad comes in with his third address in chapter 25. And we will discuss that next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please click like or make a comment. That helps our videos get promoted, and we appreciate it. Until we gather again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.